Welcome to this video on media and narrative conventions. As far as a definition goes, in the media, conventions are the unwritten rules or the generally accepted ways of creating meaning or otherwise constructing media products. These are principles and common ways of doing things, of making a media product that over time get established as just simply the way of doing things. This is why we call them the unwritten rules. Take, for example, the shape of a film. Notice how you never see a circular movie on the cinema screen, or a triangular screen, or a hexagonal screen, or anything else for that matter. Why is this? There's no law that says that all movies must be a certain shape, but this is simply due to the fact that traditionally, filmmakers wanted to maximize the space on an expensive roll of film. Films were loaded into a camera vertically, and so to make the most of that film, we would usually shoot in a wide rectangular shape. And so this became the generally accepted way of making a film, or in other words, a convention of filmmaking. When we look at conventions, we can break them up into three different types. There is the conventions of a media form, and so these are the rules and common practices for constructing a particular media form or media forms that distinguish them from others. And when we're talking about media forms here, we're talking about film is a media form that is different to a serialized TV show. And that's different to radio, which is different to newspapers and magazines, photography, video games, social media, etc. All of these are their own media forms. And so within that, they have their own conventions. Inside each media form, you might find that there are conventions of genre. And these are the rules that define genres and set them apart from others within that particular media form. Now, genres are something that evolve and change with audience expectations, and so they are subject to debate, and the rules that might define a genre in one decade may change and include other things, or stop including things that have changed over time. So genres are evolving, but generally we can categorize different genres based on their similarities within a media form. And then finally, we have narrative conventions. So these are the common elements or the typical ways of structuring a story. These can be found across media forms and might include things like novels and news reports and documentaries, as well as fictional media. So when we're talking about conventions of form, we can see here, quite obviously, you would notice that this is a newspaper. But why do you know that? It's pretty hard to read the finer text here, but we can see that there are some common features, some distinguishing characteristics that make this a newspaper. And these are the conventions of form. So as we're looking here at this example, what are 6 conventions that you can see that are related to the form of newspapers? Now, if you can't quite make out this writing, perhaps you'd like to look up your own newspaper online to find what some of those characteristics and conventions are. But here's one for free. We can see that on most newspapers, towards the top, usually on the left, we find the date. So that is something that is common across all newspapers all across the world. It is a distinguishing feature that has become a convention. So see if you can spot any others. Now, when we're talking about conventions of form, we use these to distinguish one media form from another. Take, for example, newspapers and magazines. They're really similar in many ways. They include articles, they have a combination of images and text. You pick them up, they tend to be portrait in size, and we flip through from the front and to the back. But there are some things that distinguish them apart from each other. We can see here in the two examples. One simple example is the masthead position. So the masthead is the name that we give for the actual title of that newspaper or magazine. And you can see here the Australian, it is set on a white background and it is nice and clear, there's nothing obstructing it. But we would typically find on a magazine, perhaps the masthead sits behind the subject of the photo, which here is Mr. Styles. And so that is a simple difference where the masthead is unobstructed on a newspaper, but it can be obstructed on a magazine. That's one thing that distinguishes these two media forms apart from each other. But the media form that we're interested in for this area of study is the form of narrative film. And so here are some of the conventions related to that form in particular. We might use these to distinguish them from a similar media form such as television. So films will typically follow what we call a 3-act structure, where there is an opening sequence where we're introduced to the characters in the story as well as the normal world that they live in. And then in the middle part of a film, we have what's called the development. That's when we might find our characters engage with some challenges that increase in complexity. There might be some loss and new characters met and some change along the way. And that builds up, that rising action and tension builds up towards a climax that happens in probably the last quarter of the film, where there's a big moment where our protagonist must overcome a major obstacle, and then finally we establish the new normal, in which we call the resolution or the denouement. This structure differs from television, for example, where you might have a storyline that isn't resolved at the end of an episode, but rather goes across an entire season or even across multiple seasons in a whole series. So that 3-act structure is pretty unique to film. Another characteristic that is unique to film is that they typically run for 80 to 180 minutes long. If you bought a ticket to go and see a film in the cinema and it turned out to only be an hour long, you might feel like you were ripped off. In the same way, if you go to the cinema and you find that the movie that you've bought a ticket for is running for 5 hours, you might not last the distance. Narrative films also, particularly the ones that we are experienced with in Hollywood, tend to have higher production values than TV series. And when we say high production values, they tend to have a bigger budget and so can spend more money, and therefore you might find that there are a higher caliber of actors, more popular actors are starring in it. You might find that they are shooting across multiple sets and locations, that they're using real world locations, or that the sets that they use are elaborate and grand in design. They're quite large compared to the smaller studios of a television series. You might find that they have a bigger orchestra that plays with more instruments that gives you that cinematic sound, and you find that they are probably using higher end camera equipment to record the actual film, which gives it that cinema quality compared to television. You also might find, as a result of this bigger budget and higher quality, that you find that more sequences are visual in nature. They're more striking. There's a more elaborate use of camera movement compared to television, which typically relies on more dialogue. You might find that the storytelling in films are more visual in nature and rely less on dialogue. And finally, a very simple one, it is a convention of a narrative film that the credits will roll at the end. It would be pretty awkward if in the middle of a scene you find the credits start to roll and you've got to sit through them for 10 minutes before the rest of the film continues. And so within each media form, you can find that there are different genres that have their own set of rules or conventions. So a French word meaning like or kind, genre, it refers to the way that we can categorize media products within the same media form that are alike or of a similar kind. They will follow their own set of conventional rules so that we as an audience can distinguish different genres from each other. So here a simple example of magazines where we've got the gossip magazines here at the top, and we can see that there is a lot of similarity between them. We've got the cluttered layout with lots of images. We've got these bursts of color. They typically use some really eye-catching color, some contrasting, almost sickly colors that really jump out. There's lots of text to explain all the different articles that might be in this magazine. Compare that to the more subtle and subdued fashion magazines, where there is a lot less text. There is a lot less variation in color. In fact, we can see here we've got pretty monotone colors used in the fonts in the text. We have a very simple single image of one model wearing something fashionable. So you can see the difference. If you are going into a news agency, you would know that if you're after a fashion magazine, you would know, even if you're not familiar with Rush, that just by the conventions of its front cover, that it could be the fashion magazine that you're looking for. In terms of film, genre conventions can be based on the use of similar settings, costuming, the use of and type of music, the type of characters that appear. So here we have 3 Western genre films from 3 very different periods of time, from the 1960s to the 80s to the 2010s. And even though these films are made far, far apart from each other, they all have very similar settings. They all have similar use of costuming, as we can see here, the same types of characters, and we can almost imagine, as you're sitting there, if you're familiar with Westerns, you can probably imagine the type of music that's played across all 3 of these. Film genre conventions can also include the similar use of story arcs, how a story is structured and how it changes across an entire film. An example of that might be a rom-com. You would typically expect that the structure of the rom-com is 2 people are presented separately at the start of the film. They come together, they might have some conflict along the way, and end up in the resolution together. Similar structure across all narratives within the rom-com genre. You might find that there are similar plot devices too. So that might be something like in an adventure film, you have a MacGuffin. It's what we call a prop, or something that our heroes are searching for, are looking for. You might find that that's the plot device that is common across that genre. You could also find that there are similar moments in films of the same genre. We mentioned rom-coms before. That moment where our couple meets for the first time is often referred to as the meet cute. That moment is typically replicated across all rom-com films. You might find a similar moment in the use of a superhero landing, where we have a hero landing or dropping from the sky and landing typically with one knee on the ground in a heroic fashion. And so that leads us to the similar use of symbolic or visual cues. So that superhero landing, we might typically expect that to be shot from a low angle. And so that is a common characteristic of a superhero genre film. And so therefore it's established as a convention. Think now about a genre that you like to watch and list as many conventions that you can think from this genre. A good way to do this is to perhaps think of 2 or 3 films that you know sit within that genre and compare what they have in common. If you're struggling to think, here is a list of common genres there. Maybe if you can't pick a particular favorite of your own, then choose one that you know is really quite obvious in its conventions. Something to note now as we're talking about these conventions as being common and generally accepted rules is that sometimes rules are made to be broken. Because conventions are these rules based on generally accepted ways of doing things rather than hard locked laws, this means that media producers have a little bit of flexibility and don't always have to stick to conventions. Sometimes movies will do something unconventional, thereby breaking the established practice. When they do this, it subverts audience expectations. So what that means is it takes what the audience will expect from a particular genre or a particular media form and it flips it on its head. What this can do is create a refreshing surprise for the audience. So we might see something like when Ferris Bueller's Day Off broke the convention of your rolling credits are the final thing in a film and typically what is rolling when audiences are leaving the cinema. They broke that convention by having an extra scene after the credits, a post-credit scene. Now, over time, this has become more popular as audiences found that they really enjoyed it. And it was something that the original X-Men series in the early 2000s, they took on to have a post-credit scene that hinted at a potential sequel. And then this was later picked up by the Marvel Studios' first film, Iron Man, and they included a new character being introduced in a post-credit scene that would later set up the Avengers film. And so now it has become a common practice within superhero genre films to have this post-credit scene. Even now, it's gone so out of control that Deadpool directly parodied the original post-credit scene from Ferris Bueller as part of their presentation of and commentary of the post-credit phenomenon that was across all superhero films. And so finally, the last convention that we're going to look at is conventions of narrative. And so these conventions stretch across a range of media forms and genres, but they are common to fictional narratives or all stories. There are many narrative conventions, but for the sake of ease, we are going to focus on 3 in particular: cause and effect, point of view, and character arcs. So the convention of cause and effect refers to the links between events in a story that advance that narrative from one event to another. We typically don't see a film that just has random scenes or random shots thrown at us without any logical connection between them. So we can think of these links between events in a narrative as a causal chain and represented by the words therefore and however. So take The Lion King for an example. Hopefully you are familiar with the story, but it goes along the lines of this. Simba is born, Therefore, Mufasa grooms him to grow up to be king. However, Scar wants to be king himself. Therefore, Scar kills Mufasa and blames Simba. Therefore, Simba runs away. However, Nala finds Simba, and therefore Simba returns to the kingdom to challenge Scar for the throne. And so we can see this isn't just a list of things that happen in the film, it is a list of things that are connected by that idea of, therefore, if one thing happens, therefore the next thing will happen, or however. So when one thing happens, but something else opposite happens. And so cause and effect is really important for driving narrative progression, or in other words, moving that story forward from event to event. We don't want our narratives to have because if we've got one event and another event happens and there's no connection between them, we might find that the audience is lost. Point of view in terms of the narrative convention, it refers to the perspective from which the story is told. Generally speaking, films can be presented in two different types of point of view. We might have a subjective point of view where the audience sees things from a character's perspective. Now, this can be indicated by literal point of view shots that we find here in E.T. the Extraterrestrial, but also subjective point of view might just be if we are following one character in each scene of a film. An example of this might be a murder mystery. It would be pretty boring if we found out who the murderer was right at the start. Instead, the film's presented from the subjective point of view of the detective or the person investigating the crime, and we, the audience, are only finding out the clues as they are, and so we're getting things from that character's perspective. The opposite of this, of course, is the objective point of view. And that's when the audience is placed in the position where they see things as an external observer and they can see all parts of the narrative rather than ones that only a character can see. So we might be presented something like a hero's point of view and then cut to the villain's perspective too. And so we as an audience, we have this objective view and we have a more rounded understanding about everything that's going on. Finally, we have character arcs as a narrative convention. This refers to the inner journey and the type of change that a character experiences over the course of a narrative. This isn't physical change, but rather how that character themselves changes from the start of the film until the end. Now, there are many different types of character arc, but we are going to look at the most common four. The first character arc is the transformation arc. This is where a character experiences a complete change, and typically a complete and positive change. So they might go from a regular everyday person to a hero. And so the example here is Harry Potter. He starts off the very first film or the very first novel as a boy living under the stairs of his auntie and uncle's house. He's treated as a second-class citizen, and eventually he becomes the world's strongest wizard. That is a complete transformation in the character. Another character arc that's a little bit more subtle is the growth arc. This is where a character matures or becomes a better version of themselves at the end of the narrative compared to the start, rather than completely changing. So the example here is Belle from Beauty and the Beast. She starts off the film as a headstrong, intelligent, independent, caring young woman, and she ends up being tested with the her intelligence and caring nature by her experiences with the beast, and in the end she becomes a better version of that intelligent, independent, caring person that she was at the start. The opposite to these positive character arcs are a negative one. So here we have what's called the fall arc. And this is where a character declines or loses, essentially, often through their own bad choices, and is worse off at the end of a narrative compared to the start, and often they will meet a tragic end, whether that is jail or death. The example here is Anakin Skywalker, aka Darth Vader. So whether you take the entire Star Wars saga as your example, you might think that there is a bit of a rise and fall arc, going from a boy living in poverty who is then chosen and trained to be superpowered in the same way that I guess Harry Potter was, but then through his own choices declines and is horrifically scarred and injured and then eventually dies. Or you could simply look at the character of Darth Vader in perhaps the first Star Wars film, where he's presented as at the start as the big, bad, strong, most powerful Jedi in the galaxy, and then eventually he is fought off by Luke Skywalker and the rebels, and his Death Star is destroyed. Either way, the character experiences a fall arc. And then the final character arc, which isn't really an arc at all, it's more a flat line. This is what we call the flat character arc. This is where the character experiences no change, no growth, no decline. They are the same person at the end of the narrative as they are at the start. So James Bond here is your example of a flat character arc, where at the start of each film he is the womanizing world's most dangerous spy, and at the end of the film he is a womanizing world's most dangerous spy. The character doesn't really change one way or another from film to film. And so there you have a summary of the different character arcs that we might find in a film. Typically in a narrative, we will see multiple arcs. We often don't see just the one arc repeated across all characters, because otherwise that would present a pretty boring narrative. So you might like to think about the films that you have studied or that you yourself enjoy, and think about which characters from them follow each of these basic and essential character arcs. So that is film and narrative conventions. Please make sure that you are taking notes on this, and thank you so much for viewing.